It gives me great privilege and honor to announce the next speaker. Dr. Jess J. Hargrove has always had a research interest in post-slavery and healthcare concerns of African Americans. Hargrove is the great grandson of ex-slave Celia Adams and Solomon Hargrove, who was lynched in the old slave capital of Louisville, Georgia. One of his research interests is to identify the conditions within communities that give rise to certain healthcare problems. He earned his bachelor's degree from Dillard University and received the Master's of Art in Spanish and a PhD degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is a distinguished educator, poet, and a neologist. He is the author of 3 books: The Best Poetry in America, Closing the Achievement Gap in America, A National Imperative for a Superman, a Superwoman, and a Superintendent, and the recently published The Legacy of Celia Adams, From Slavery to Freedom, a work tracing his roots, the ex-slave Celia Adams. He has assisted with editing Muhammad Ali, The Untold Story, Skin Color Cannot Think Nor Reason in 2019. He has entered his 23rd year of the employment of Philander Smith College. He is an associate professor of Spanish and has served in administration as interim vice president of academic affairs, associate vice president for academic affairs, associate dean of instruction, and assistant dean of instruction. Hargrove has also served as chair of the Division of Humanities, chair of Division of Education, interim dean of students, and associate vice president for enrollment management. He enjoys teaching, scholarship, research, and service to college and communities. In 2019, Hargrove was the explanatory teacher of the year, General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. Governor Asa Hutchinson appointed Hargrove in 2018 to the Black History Commission of Arkansas. Previously, Hargrove was appointed by Governor Mike Beebe as inaugural chair of the Arkansas Commission on Closing the Achievement Gap. His appointment by Governor Mike Beebe enabled him to serve 11 years until his recent appointment by Governor Asa Hutchinson. Prior to coming to Arkansas, Hargrove taught the Broward County, Florida public school as a Spanish teacher, 6th through 8th grades. William Dandy Middle School in 1998-99. He was hired as a principal provost of a public charter school under Friends of Children in 1997 and 98. This charter school had the promise of being a model program in teacher training and curriculum innovation when the then soon-to-be elected governor, Jeb Bush, visited the program on Sistrunk Boulevard. When Hargrove was hired at the University of Arizona in fall of 1989, he was invited to be a visiting professor in the Transfer Summer Institute, which was under the leadership of Erlinda Torres Medina, who was director of the Center of Transferred Students. This course empowered students to develop skills that enabled them to acquire knowledge and information for college. Survivor, multicultural career development and citizenship. Students wrote papers on diversity in the 21st century and gave daily solutions of solving discrimination problems and bias reduction strategies based on the ism that promotes hatred and misunderstanding. Throughout his 8-year tenure at the University of Arizona, he was a guest lecturer at the classroom level. He shared information that enabled and empowered others to develop the willpower to make needed changes for this increasingly diverse society of the 21st century. These experiences, coupled with the October 1991 invitation from the Jewish Community Relation Council, enabled Hargrove to be a part of multiracial coalition and visit Jerusalem, Israel, and Palestine. So please, let's welcome Dr. Hargrove.
Wonderful. I want to thank Ms. Pat Johnson for the wonderful introduction, which is longer than my presentation. So let me.
I wanted to get it all in.
I thank you. Today, I want to share that we live in an inclusive society, one that recognizes fairness, one that recognizes equality and freedom for everyone to exist and to belong in one society. However, when I began to look at the fairness that existed in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, I found that all was not fair and certainly all was not equal, particularly as it relates to the healthcare of African Americans. Let's take a look at the separate hospital for coloreds. There is equal funding, equal facilities, equal staffing, or was there unequal funding, facilities, and staffing? I want you to look at the healthcare disparities that are due to separate but equal policies that exist today. And then I want you to have some takeaways from the presentations and some outcomes that you've learned from hidden hospital history. The picture that you're looking at, it has, which era do you think that the housing patterns were popularized in the United States? Was it before Civil War, during enslavement period, or was it after the Civil War, between 1865 to 1895? Or was these two pictures taken 1896 after Plessy versus Ferguson? You can chat me. One, two, or three. 1896. Any others? Number two would be after the Civil War, 1865 to 95. One, before the Civil War, during enslavement. You're correct. But if this picture was taken before the Civil War And during the period of enslavement, when did segregation and separate but equal began? If they're separate but equal in this picture during the Civil War. 1896 was Plessy versus Ferguson. But why was the separate but equal still being practiced during the period of enslavement to 1896? And was it going on after Plessy in the 1900s when many of our hospitals were being formed and established? You're going to see that my presentation is about the first Negro hospital that was established in Arkansas. Funding for that hospital was 1923, but it opened January 1 of 1931. So today, I want to begin to explore what it means to have a separate facility, particularly when everyone is experiencing the same conditions. They were experiencing tuberculosis and they needed a hospital, but they had a separate but equal policy that separated the races in the hospital who were suffering from the same disease, tuberculosis. And so I took an ethnographic approach, research approach, to understanding this particular behavior of race separation based on medicine and health. This strange hospital located in the city of Alexander you can see it has been abandoned since 2011. However, during the pandemic of April 2020, there was an attempt to burn it down to the ground. I began to research more about this place called the McRae Sanatorium. And what I found were stories about the human condition. This hospital was a part of the African-American story of hospitals in America. They existed, oh yes, and they lived out their usefulness, but no one told their stories and how they lived, how they survived, how the people thrived. These are stories about patients, stories about doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers, stories that tell the medical history that existed in Arkansas, and stories that should be told around the kitchen tables and on playgrounds and beyond. What I learned about this old Negro hospital, this old colored hospital, shook me to the core. What is this story so hidden from public view, so rarely told, so infrequently told to the public? An old man who lived in the city of Alexander approached me near the train station across from Alexander City Hall and the post office, and he wanted to talk. We talked about the nearby gas station. He expressed to me how badly he felt about the police, the numerous police shootings and the goings on of unfairness in America. Then he expressed remorse about the Negro hospital being burned. As we engaged in the conversation, he mentioned that, quote, this old hospital was the only place that the colored people around here could go, unquote. He said, quote, I know what they were trying to get when they burnt that building. They wanted to burn it down because they were trying to get rid of history and to get the bricks. I said, to get the bricks? He said, do you know, sir, I was dressed as I pretty much am now. Do you know that those bricks from that colored hospital are so valuable that everyone could be a millionaire in this town? I was intrigued. The bricks, he said, were imported from the East, someplace like Pennsylvania, and brought in by train on that train tracks that you see behind us. It was an old colored town, Alexander was, he explained to me. My research shifted to the reasons why African Americans could not have lived in the Little Rock community. Why did they cluster themselves in certain migration towns, mining towns, towns that would eventually lead to poor health conditions of African Americans? These were conditions that would affect their lungs and respiratory system. Conditions for tuberculosis began to affect many of those who followed the migrations pattern from central Arkansas. However, migration patterns continued to central Arkansas. The migration of African Americans to central Arkansas is able to be traced to more than a dozen communities that have mining ties. The Great Migration within the United States occurred often, people think, in the 1920s through the 1970s. Migration often looked at the decline of people from the South to the North, to the Midwest, to the East, but not to Central Arkansas. These exodus of people from rural communities and towns is associated with low-paying jobs or declining workforce, which necessitates their settlement and resettlement elsewhere. However, for Blacks in Central Arkansas, the population increase during the census time frame from the 1920s to the 1950s show a different image of people who came but were impacted by healthcare conditions from the mining industry of Central Arkansas. One informant stated that this was a dusty mining industry, and Blacks were those who were expendable to those conditions. Central Arkansas communities, you've heard of them. There are 12 of them, such as Alexander, such as a city called Bauxite, Benton, another one, Bryant. They call the one in Bryant, I'll use a pretty word called Negro Hill rather than the other N word. When they were forced to move from Bauxite to Negro Hill. And so College Station, Granite Mountain, Hard Scramble, these are communities that Blacks were forced to live into. Higgins Switch, Malvern, Josephine Pankey Community Estate, Sweet Home, and the last 12th one is Wrightsville. were the cities to which Blacks often migrated or relocated with family to find jobs in this burgeoning enclave for obtaining housing, as well as for protection from the racial horrors of Jim Crow Arkansas. These were 12 communities in Arkansas that surrounded the Little Rock community when they were not allowed to live, they said, in Little Rock. So they clustered themselves on the outskirts in these 12 communities. And the hospital, the McRae Center, was in the center of their existence, of those communities. When I interviewed the descendants of the migrants, they pointed me to people that they knew in all 12 of these communities. Still today, Blacks found themselves looking for bauxite in unhealthy mine pits. They were in granite holes where the granite rocks. They were in Reynolds mining aluminum in this area. In 3M, breathing rock dust, as told to me. And often they found themselves in the Alcoa blue waters, sinkholes where germs and bitter air exists. Separate but equal in Jim Crow laws forced Blacks to live away from towns and cities in Arkansas, such as Little Rock. Discrimination in housing and unhealthy working conditions in underground mines caused Blacks to have health conditions such as consumption, or this new term called tuberculosis at the time, but it was known as consumption during that era, that a person was suffering from consumption. And they told me that my grandfather suffered from consumption. The unhealthy conditions that Blacks confronted were so grave that Black community leaders such as Dr. George William Stanley Ish and his wife Ursel Ish and Miss Earl Chambers, who was executive director of the Arkansas Tuberculosis Association, found themselves meeting with Arkansas politicians to establish a hospital for the Negroes, for the coloreds, for the Blacks to be treated for their condition. According to Dr. Granger and verified, Elder Granger, and verified by Mr. Hayward Hill, a prominent resident in Alexandria. I want to shift very quickly to this separate but equal so that you get a flavor. This is the white sanatorium for tuberculosis. This is the color, the Negro. I took this picture after it was burnt on the 4th floor. And they were trying to burn it down, but it would not be burnt down. Maybe those bricks, the informant was probably right when he said they're the best bricks and most expensive bricks from the East Coast. Thank goodness that it was not burnt down. We have an opportunity for preservation and to restore the 4 pillars that you see if we only come together. The Governor Thomas Chipman McRae was born. This is named after McRae when it opened. He died just a little before, and they named it after him in 1931. Governor Thomas Chipman McRae was born in December 21, 1851, and he died in 1929. He was a Washington and Lee law school graduate in 1874. He lived in Union County, Arkansas during the unsettling Civil War and its Reconstruction aftermath. He was well connected as an Arkansas legislator in 1876. He was a congressman in 1884, proud to becoming the 26th governor of Arkansas in 1920. The McRae Sanatorium, a hospital for Negroes, was named in his honor when it opened for the first patient on January 1, 1931. The hospital is located in Alexander, Arkansas. After he acquired legislative funding in 1923. It is now approaching 100 years of its centennial of the hospital's legislative funding by Governor McRae. Dr. George Ish, as you've heard earlier from our presenter, indicated that there was only 3 medical doctors in the whole United States of America who could run this newly established hospital. And he was practicing in Missouri. Dr. Hugh A. Brown comes on the scene. Dr. Hugh A. Brown. That's him. That's his lovely wife, Norma Jean Brown, an administrative assistant and personnel director. Dr. Brown was the superintendent and the medical director from 1931 until his death 31 years later in 1962. And so it was Dr. Ish's job to convince Dr. Hugh Brown, who was a 1928 graduate from Howard University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ish had to persuade him to give up, how much were doctors making back then in Missouri, Kansas City? $1,500 monthly salary. He had to convince him to come down south in the heart of Jim Crow to accept $200, a major drop from $1,500 a month to $200 a month. And he was reluctant to accept the $200 a month. But Dr. Ish was persistent. And he said that he was successful in stating that this was an opportunity to do something special for your race. And such an opportunity may never come around again. Dr. Hugh Brown worked tirelessly when he accepted the $200 a month. And he worked for 31 years until his death in 62. The hospital patients were merged with other white hospital patients after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. The Alexander Human Development Center took over the property. 43 years they stayed there until it closed in 2011, the Human Development Center. Currently, the 65-acre McRae Hospital is unoccupied in Alexander, but last year it was sold for how much money? $1, under a controversial situation. between the city and a private, the city of Alexander, who wants it, and a private company that bought it for $1. During the initial months of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, a fire was set on the 4th floor of the McRae Sanatorium in an attempt to burn it down, to burn the last remainder and the reminder of the separate but equal past that existed in Arkansas and the impact that segregation had on many communities in the state of Arkansas. And so we're looking for community champions to team with the Black History Commission of Arkansas to preserve the original hospital that was to treat and to prevent the conditions that caused the spread of tuberculosis. It's a great cause to have a tourist attraction in our own central Arkansas area and in our state of Arkansas. The last vestiges of separate but equal hospital, nearly 100 years old. The ties to Governor Chipman McRae and the McRae Sanatorium for tuberculosis are calling for history to be preserved. The hospital, the building, is requested to be repurposed and restructured as soon as the 100-year historic relic it is. A tour site for economic benefit to businesses, for stories about the medical profession, and stories about the state of Arkansas. The new McRae Sanatorium relief access trail, I can envision, will intersect with I-30 through the repurposed McRae Sanatorium to relieve the traffic congestions on the Alexander I-30 corridor. There are opportunities through medicine, stories in Arkansas to make a difference, to share history about the Negro hospitals, the African-American professionals that existed to make a difference and are still making a difference in Arkansas. What are the disparities of a separate but equal hospital facility? One, the campus acreage. The McRae Center had 65 acres as compared to 900 acres for the Boonesville White Sanatorium, separate but equal. Number two, legislative appropriations in 1923, McRae, $26,000 for construction, for Boonville, $50,000. Number three, McRae provided an additional received an additional $7,000 for equipment versus $30,000 for maintenance. McRae had 26 beds when it opened in 1931. 500 beds when the Boonville Sanatorium opened. The unequal funding, $43,000 versus $80,000 for Boonville, is obvious. Unequal opening was 21 years later. The McRae was 1931 opening. Boonville opened in 1910. The legislation was 1909. And so you can see separate but equal emerging many decades earlier. Unequal staffing, unequal training. And so that's the way it was. Thank goodness we have forward thinking about how to prepare young professionals for the future. This is Philander Smith College that bears the name of one of its distinguished 1952 graduate alum, Dr. Jocelyn Elder's School of Ally and Public Health. We're trying to make a difference in the medical profession so that the training will not be unequal in the future. This is the Deuce Millennium generation that we are preparing. And so Dr. Edith Jones broke down, just as she broke down the barriers in 1948, when she became the first African-American at UAMS Medical School. She did something important. She spoke at Philander Smith College. Her husband, you can see, became the dean at another historically Black college, Texas Southern University, died in 1989. But before she graduated in 1952, another prominent doctor is coming on the scene. Dr. Jones gave a lecture to a sorority. Perhaps it was Delta Sigma Theta at Philander Smith College, because we know Dr. Jocelyn Elders is a proud member in Little Rock. And it moved this student, Dr. Jocelyn Elders, the article says, to become a doctor. Dr. Elders would go on to serve, the article continues, as the United States Surgeon General in the 1990s. And so this is that 65-acre property that is abandoned, called the Alexander Human Development Center. No trespassing. Beautiful campus. Water behind it. Ducks flock there. How do I know? Because I live 1 block away. I did not know when I moved from Little Rock to Alexander that this hospital, that this Human Development Center was the first African-American hospital to exist in the state of Arkansas. And so it's our challenge, particularly during African-American History Month, to make a difference in our communities, in our profession. Medicine, we know, has made a difference. And so this is what we must do. Look at the statistics. This, Dr. McRae, the nurse, the doctors and the nurses. And so that's the picture that one of the informants looked through his wife's, who worked at this sanatorium, her papers. And I asked, can I make a copy of these historic pictures? You can see Dr. Brown to the left and Dr. Ish to the right, and the wife, Norma Brown, in the middle with the black dress on, who was over human resources and everything. And I'd love to, if someone could tell me who some of those historic people are. Another group that he shared with me, so precious, these images, and I think they're earlier than 57, but that's what I saw in one of them. And then the group of men, so precious. Thank goodness. I'd like to read a couple of things about the gentleman who shared these wonderful photos with me. And his wife worked at this sanatorium. And just to hear he's 90 years old. Mr. Hayward Hill reflects on the McRae Sanatorium. When I spoke to Miss Shar Hill, you may know my friend Shar Hill, was her father. I learned that her father may have information on the McRae Sanatorium. We spoke for 4 hours when she introduced me to him. Mr. Hill quickly stated that his wife worked at the sanatorium, but he worked at the rehabilitation program for the state. As a counselor, he worked. He stated that they had training programs for young boys and girls, which were located near I-30 in Roosevelt. He worked at the rehabilitation program while he was a student at Philander Smith College. I did not know that. There was a hog slaughter farm where they slaughtered hogs, he said, where he worked to make and earn extra money for college. He went to his Arch Ford training facility for 2 weeks. As you know, Arch Ford is right near the Capitol. And this was a counselor training position in 1960. Then he went to payroll. It was hard to get food. This is quite interesting. What he mentioned about that was there was a white blind man who operated the food stand. He would not sell hot dogs to me. The hot dogs were 20 cents and the hamburgers were 25 cents. But they had a policy, quote, "We don't serve blacks," unquote. And he said as such to him. He stated that it was a kind of lonely thing with no one to talk to back then. Unquote. He indicated that he was born in 1931, January 16th. He reflected back on his friend. Quote, "There was a young lady, his friend, Gwen Countryman, a white lady. She would buy me food because they wouldn't sell me food. They wouldn't sell it to other black people too. I tried to pay her back, but she would not accept any money from me. She was my friend. I worked as a supervisor, yet I couldn't eat on the premises of the Arch Ford building. I worked 37 years and 6 months," he said, "at the Arkansas State Rehabilitation Program as a counselor for disabilities. I would go to all black nursing homes. They all had black employees. Bell Road had a black hospital, or I may have that different. When we would treat people who suffered from alcoholism, and we would treat people who suffered on drugs. This was near Sweet Home. They had motels back then because you couldn't go to Little Rock to live. So you lived on the outskirts in black-owned hotels. Some were off Broadway. There were others like Green Stamp Place that you could live in this area. The law had a system to tell you how to act, he said, and they had a system to tell you where to go. They were pretty strict on where you could go and what you could do. So I went to the Korean, I was in a Korean War vet, and they still had a system working and operating against us. However, I was thankful that I had a relative who had just married a gentleman by the name of Crawford J. Mims. She was my cousin, and he gave me a basketball scholarship at Shorter College. Ellen Louise Hall was a young lady that I had met from Tulsa, Oklahoma in Little Rock, and she was my girlfriend. We married in 1959. Paul Quinn College tried to recruit me away, but I remember the story about they wouldn't sell me a hamburger or a hot dog because I was Black. I kept reflecting back. When I drove to Tulsa, Oklahoma, I would go to Pinky Estate Edition to get a few hamburgers to put in my car as I headed to Oklahoma to see my girlfriend. I was so happy to see her. I came from Ripley, Mississippi, where Crawford J. Mims had once lived. And in Ripley, there was a man that wanted to keep me there. But I went on to the military for 2 years and did standby reserve for 2 years. However, when Crawford J. Mims married my cousin, I immediately left Ripley and came to Little Rock and played basketball for Crawford Mims. He said he often went to the Alexander Hospital as a rehab worker. He said, quote, I helped Dr. Hugh Brown move back to Kansas City after his retirement. So they moved him to Kansas City. And we went up there and built a home for him. Mr. Hayward Hill stated that he wanted to get away from Mississippi because they were paying 25 cents for gas, and he was a bus driver, trying to make a living. Oil, they would pay for. He was paid $65 per month. Nowadays, he said they pay $300 a month as a bus driver, school bus driver. He was a master sergeant in the military when he went to Germany, and he took 16-week training, infantry training, to go to South Korea, but instead he went to Berlin, Germany, 1952, 53. Upon returning from Berlin, Germany, he found himself dealing with tuberculosis patients. They moved the patients out of the hospital and opened clinics to treat them. Dr. Brown found that if the patients didn't get nutritious food, they would come down with tuberculosis. Discrimination was ending. And now they say, I only take white patients. That would be discrimination, and lawsuits would be brought against them because of the new federal law that was beginning to be initiated. They made it kind of rough on the people to discriminate against a person now. One thing that helped end discrimination was sports, he said, and particularly baseball. With Jackie Robinson still in those bases, they had to integrate my home. It had to integrate. In my hometown of Antioch in Mississippi Baptist Church, they gave 30 acres of land. This was the time discrimination was coming to a halt through law. With carpenters, they framed up the school for color. There were no fans and no shades on the windows in the Negro school, the colored school, the Black school. Can you imagine no fans in the building, no shades on the windows? In the white school, they built a gym for them. For the colored school, they built it out of board and wood. Antioch Colored School was its name. And Antioch Public Schools is where he drove the bus to Kippa County. Those were the years of separate but equal. And so when you began to look at the African-American production of doctors, there is a Black or African-American statistics, and these are 2017 data. 4.7% of what the American Medical Association has as employed, they make distinction between those who are in private practice and those who are employed by the military, hospitals, and so forth. That would be 2,750 Black doctors out of 55,000 employed, not to count. So when I spoke to the National Medical Association, they look at the primary care physicians. Of the primary care physicians that exist, African Americans that exist in America, they make up 41% of the Black doctors in the United States. Careers in medicine are not typical conversation, wellness class. Looking at the chronic conditions they're looking at, such as high blood pressure, arthritis of back, legs, arms. They're looking at asthma, weight gain. They're looking at depressed feelings, heart disease, strokes, headaches, digestive issues, memory issues, diabetes. So the production of African-American doctors need to increase because there are a lot of healthcare disparities going on in America. One more thing that I would like to share with you. I think it's the Dr. Brown, as I am. Let's see. Dr. Brown, thank goodness he put together a remarkable story before his exodus from the planet. He states, as patients began to return to society, the McRae superintendent, medical director, Dr. Hugh Brown, wrote in the Medical History Journal that, quote, the returning of patients to society and better diagnosis caused an increase in applications of patients. Until in 1935, we had a waiting list of over 160 people for admission to our 36 beds, 160 applications for 36 beds. During the 1936 special legislative session, the size of the McRae Sanatorium increased from 36 beds to a newly erected facility that now brought the hospital to 139 beds. The 1938 legislative session also provided for a home to house its nurses with a capacity to house 32 nurses. Dr. Brown indicated that during this period, he was able to do pneumothorax, phrenic operations, and thoracoplasty. Dr. Elders will correct me on that later. Dr. Brown stated that the return of patients to society, coupled with the addition of 139 beds, a nurse's home, and in addition to the original building to provide space where surgery could be done, better diagnosis, increased applications. The McRae Sanatorium now had a main operating room, a doctor's dressing room, and a sterilizing room for modern surgery. In addition, it had a male dormitory, quarters for marriage staff, a fire station, and a rehabilitation center, similar to what Mr. Hayward Hill talked about. The McRae Sanatorium for Negro patients was, quote, according to Dr. Brown, one of the major public health advances in Arkansas. He writes that the McRae facility is, quote, a sanatorium for Negroes who are victims of tuberculosis, unquote. And its steady growth is presently one of the largest and most complete institutions of its kind in the United States. By the time Dr. Brown completed his 31-year career at the McRae Sanatorium, the bed capacity moved from 26 beds in 1931 to 411 beds in 1962, the year of his retirement and untimely death. He had suffered from 2 strokes in the 1950s. During the 31 years of Dr. Brown's leadership at the hospital, he worked to advance the healthcare of patients, including offering courses in rehabilitation and a course in nurse training in 1940. By 1947, 2 surplus Army buildings were given to the hospital on the McRae campus to be remodeled to house cosmetology, to house sewing, cooking, manual training, an auditorium built, library, social worker's office, 2 classrooms, a barber shop, and a room for homemaking. Dr. Brown stated that this program has been expanded by the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation with counselors, with teachers, and a secretary, in addition to electrical appliances and a teacher in adult education. Dr. Brown indicated that although the hospital admitted all types of tuberculosis and all ages, a special inpatient bed has been established to take care of the diabetes, cardiac, and other complications. He wrote that, quote, in the therapy, the 5 major types of treatment that I explore are 1, rest and isolation. Number 2, adequate and appropriate food. Number 3, proper ventilation. Number 4, drug therapy. And number 5, selected surgical procedures. Dr. Brown was most proud of his laboratory, which he stated is modern in every respect for an institution of its kind. It is equipped with a virology hood, incubator, sterilizer, and other equipment that is essential for the evaluation of treatment of the tuberculosis sick, the tuberculosis. The major X-ray department, he concludes, handle his diagnostic procedures and its tomography. A wonderful story about the medical profession and hospitals in Arkansas. It's a hidden hospital history that we have now uncovered. Thank you, and I love you all. Preguntas, questions?
Outstanding. I do have a few questions that were put in the chat. The first question to Dr. Hargrove is, how did herbs influence in medicine during those times?
I'm not certain. They didn't mention that, but they did say that they had a lot of vegetables grown on that 65-acre estate property. And I'm quite certain that they played an important role because, as you know, my great-grandmother was a doctor, but they used the term in Georgia called a midwife. And she was the only Black person. So I know about the herbs part of what you're saying, and the spider webs for stitching patients in Georgia. Celie Adams, you talked about the book I had written, The Legacy of Celie Adams from Slavery to Freedom. She was the only Black doctor allowed to put her Black hands on a white patient. And she had healing hands. And so that I am aware of that, medicinal purposes. What was the next question?
The next question was consumption contagious? If so, wouldn't it have been an excellent reason for the state to invest in establishing multiple hospitals for our community throughout the state?
Yes, it was, there were many, I read about many lawsuits outside of our state, in I think Ohio or something, where there were two patients working, there were two employees working across from one another. And one had tuberculosis, had been diagnosed with tuberculosis. And because they worked across the table from one another, he described in the lawsuit that the gentleman would sneeze and he could see the droplets coming toward him, and he contracted the tuberculosis, and he was suing for the right to have monetary compensation and so forth, take care of the doctor's bill. And the judge ruled in the favor back in the day. So yes, it was contagious, but it could be overcome. And the treatment that Dr. Hugh Brown used was so working that patients began to, that he didn't have enough space for them. And that's quite interesting. What was the third?
Are any of these sites listed on the National Register of Historic Places? If so, there's grant funding available to help with restoration and preservation efforts.
That would be wonderful. Can they put their names in for volunteer? We have a thing in Spanish, voluntario o víctima, volunteer or victim. And we would like to collect names of individuals who can assist with helping with grants and various things. I know the Maryland office of Black History Commission of Maryland, I spoke with the executive director, and they have a number of funding sources. My daughter lives in Maryland, so I had an opportunity to visit the Black History Commission of Maryland while I was there. And I do have some contacts that can assist us, because certainly We don't want this opportunity and the building to be torn down for $1 with so much history to make way for a shopping mall when there are plenty of shopping malls. There are currently no stores in Alexander, the city of Alexander. There's one Mart and the General, Dollar General, I think that's what they call it. It has everything in their clothing, whatever. But they're trying to move from that side of the tracks to the growth side of the tracks. And the McRae Center is the obstacle. But we need to preserve the 4 pillars of the hospital.
Well, we do have one person that said they would love to volunteer. So I will
please.
email you their information, Dr. Hargrove, after this is over. So I'll send you their contact information. So
Wonderful.
and another question is, who currently owns the facility? I know you said it was private owned.
Yeah, yes, they that's what they're squabbling over, because the city of Little Rock thinks that they own it. Not the city of Little Rock, city of Alexander.
So do you know who actually bought it? The person who bought it
No.
for $1?
No, the state owns it. So
Uh-huh.
that would take a conversation with the governor not to sell it.
Oh,
Yes, the governor can block it because it belongs to the state of Arkansas.
so how did they sell it for $1?
Because nobody is, what was that poem that I love to tell the students? That who's asleep at the wheel? What causes growth and people to moan is because they don't see the injustice, and it's right at home. So
Okay.
you have to, when justice is asleep, we moan and weep. When justice is asleep, we cry out to our people. The pain we cannot keep when justice falls asleep. So we don't want justice to fall asleep.
There's a comment in the chat says, wonderful job. I grew up in Granny Heights. Excellent insight into formation of the African American communities during the 1900s. My obstetricianist growing up was Dr. William H. Towns, a civil rights representative. I've always wondered what happened to clinics like Granny Mountain East End and Community South End community centers. Can you expound on what happened to those?
No, I can't, because that didn't pop up. But what I what I did was, in doing an ethnographic research approach, it discovers information over time, and we're discovering. So when you begin to talk about these hidden hospital histories, information such as you just mentioned pops up, and someone says, "Oh, I'm going to investigate that. I did not know that angle of the story." And so there was probably a lot similar to that going on. And I appreciate you sharing that, because now we can research that. These will we get copies of these comments in the chat?
I am copying and pasting this, so I will email it to you.
Okay, I see 73 comments, 73 chat.
Some of it just great job, thank you, awesome job. Someone stated it would seem that even an application for a historical register would put an injunction in place to stop the demolition.
Ooh, that's wonderful. Let's do it. Let's do it. I'm not a rebel from heart. I'm just a rebel. I come from the long lineage of Celie Adams, from slavery to freedom. And Celia Adams lived 43 years in the 1800s and another 44, 44 before the 1900s and 43. So she lived 87 years life, and she died in 1943. So we have a lot of history about the African-American people, and from the stories from slavery to freedom, as told to her grandchildren. One of my fathers and uncles lived in her home. They were born in the 20s in 1919.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Hargrove. If there's not any more questions, you did an awesome job. I'm sitting here just like, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I do want to mention to them that the story that was in the introduction, how that came about was I was the first African-American to testify before the Senate Rules and Administration Committee. Senator John McCain, when I was working at the University of Arizona in Tucson, invited me to testify in Washington, D.C. to the Senate Rules and Administration Committee for the National African-American History Museum Act. That was to establish a museum for African Americans. And as you know, Barack Obama dedicated that museum some 25 years after my testimony. We are slow to move on issues.
Someone commented, would it help for all of them to contact the city of Alexandria on behalf of saving this historical treasure?
Let's try to meet with the governor because and try to get some things established, because the governor can have that type of power rather and not the city. The governor can rescind decisions. Okay.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Hargrove. Like I said, awesome information that you share with us. And I'm gonna have to go to Alexandria. I go to Alexandria all the time. Never even knew that hospital was there. You educated me, and thank you